No. First of all, this was not a retaliation because none of the people killed were Israelis. And the people trying to kill the people in Lebanon, the Arabs that are there, the Muslims and Christians, are Israelis. So this was not to retaliate for the Druze losses. That's nonsense. This is part of a larger plan that Mr. Netanyahu came to Washington with, and which he briefed to key members of the Senate and the House. And this is the plan to invade southern Lebanon with the objective of destroying Hezbollah and essentially seizing control of all the territory up to the Litani River. And they've flatly said if anyone is south of the Litani when they attack, they risk being killed because they will regard everyone and everything they meet as the enemy. Now, those are things said behind closed doors. But the bottom line of all of this is that Israel is determined to realize this objective of Greater Israel. Israeli soldiers are now walking around with patches on their uniforms that show the map of Greater Israel. In other words, Israel with the West Bank and Gaza completely in Israeli hands and potentially up to the Litani River. Now, I didn't get a close enough view to see if that patch reaches all the way to the Litani River. It may. But it certainly eliminates the Arabs that are currently living on what Israel considers Greater Israel. So that's the plan. That's the objective. That's where they want to go. And they are absolutely convinced that with American help, support, and assistance, they will be successful.
And how much of Lebanon is that if they would take that much land?
You've got to look at the map. Find the Litani River. The Litani River is south of Beirut. And the Israelis have been there before. They've crossed it previously and gone all the way to Beirut. It was an unhappy experience. And after having occupied southern Lebanon, this creature we call Hezbollah was created largely as a response to the Israeli occupation. So when Israel leaves in 1982, it is Hezbollah that is the legacy of their occupation. I think that's something we in the West don't pay much attention to. I mean, that came up for discussion, by the way, in 2002 when there was planning underway for the invasion of Iraq. And most of the senior military leadership did understand at the time, I'm talking about the U.S. military leadership, that occupation of Iraq by a U.S. and allied European force would not succeed because it was an alien entity that would be rejected by the Muslim Arabs. We are seen as Christians. Whether or not we all are is another matter, but that's the way the Arabs view us. So I think the Israelis learned the hard way that there is no benefit to occupying Arab societies. So now that apparently the new option is to eliminate the Arab society, and then the land belongs to you. And they think there's no alternative to destroying Hezbollah. And the only way to do that is scorched earth all the way to the Litani River.
Like they did in Gaza, basically, the same strategy.
Now, I would expect the same thing to happen. The problem, of course, is that how do you isolate this from the rest of the region? It's not possible. And earlier today, Erdogan, who has thus far been a disappointing blowhard to most of the Muslim world, has finally said, we won't tolerate this. If Israel goes into Lebanon, we will enter the conflict. Now, how that happens and what he precisely means, I don't know, but the Turks have always been the gorilla, what we call the 500-pound gorilla in the corner. And the Israelis have sort of dismissed the Turks out of hand as never really coming into this, and no one should worry about it, and focusing instead on Iran. But the truth is, the Turks and the Iranians are very, very different people. The Turks have a very strong martial tradition. They are a warlike people, and they are deeply offended by what the Israelis have done to the Muslim Arabs in Palestine, notwithstanding the fact that lots of Arabs are suspicious of Turks for reasons of history and the Ottoman Empire. But I think today, certainly the Arabs, Sunni and Shia, would welcome Turkish intervention as an alternative to Israeli destruction.
And the Turks, of course, would also get a lot of extra refugees should Israel decide to enter Lebanon. Yeah.
Oh, no, I think that's a critical point. Somebody said, well, what do you think has happened with Mr. Erdogan? And I said, I think in his latest meetings with the National Defense Council, senior officers have been very blunt and said, if the Israelis go into Lebanon, they will destroy it. If Lebanon is destroyed, we are at high risk in this country from all sorts of strategic outcomes. And we will be seen or viewed throughout the Muslim world as traitors, as having helped the Israelis effectively destroy the Muslim peoples of Lebanon and Palestine. So I think he's finally pushed into a corner. And I think he was trying to send a signal that we will act. And I think it would be a mistake for the Israelis to dismiss this out of hand.
Yeah, because then we get into a very interesting situation. Should Israel get into a war with Turkey, Turkey being a NATO member, how is the US going to respond to that?
Well, NATO is not a terribly meaningful entity anyhow. We pay lip service to it all the time. It's a sort of, monument in the corner. Everybody genuflects to it because they want you to believe it's important and so forth. But in truth, no, I think NATO is in shambles. And I said in January of 2022 that if we went ahead and provoked Russia into this attack, made it impossible for the Russians to not stay out of Ukraine. And if you remember, the Russians tabled many, many proposals for discussion. We rejected all of them. We out of hand said no. We wouldn't even look at them carefully. That left the Russians no alternative. And I think that's the problem now with the way we are doing business in the Middle East. We have unconditionally signed on to support Israel. Now I think there are people in the White House, fewer on the Hill, because the Hill is not a place where people think carefully about anything. But in the White House and certainly in the Department of Defense, people are very concerned because you're looking at an alignment now with not only Turkey, but also Iran and virtually all the Sunni Arabs in the region against Israel. And if Israel strikes hard against the Turks and or the Iranians, it's impossible for the Russians to stand by and ignore it. The Russians are not going to allow Iran to go under. I don't think the Russians would allow Turkey to go under. Russia has an interest in stability in the region. And I think that's what Russia wants, and I think that's the message from China. This enormously important meeting with the Chinese that was recently held as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Council or organization, it involved the various parties to the Palestinian cause, not just Hamas, but the rest of them. And the goal was not the destruction of Israel. The goal was we've got to have stability in the region. There has to be a settlement. That settlement has to be imposed. The United States cannot do that because of its unconditional support for Israel. So I think everybody else is looking at this from the standpoint of what can we do to avoid a war? And the United States seemed hell-bent to ensure that there will be a war. And that continues regarding Ukraine as well.
Yeah, and China, of course, also has every reason to not want a war there, because if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, then China is also in economic trouble.
Well, you've got to look at the Belt and Road Initiative. We treat that as some sort of Trojan horse for Chinese imperial power to conquer the world. China is not interested in that. They don't have a history of that. The only time China was aggressive was under its Mongolian emperors, and that's because the Mongols had already conquered the place. China is by no means interested in that. The Chinese have enough trouble governing themselves. Remember, there are probably four versions of the United States inside China. If you're President Xi, you wake up every morning with a headache trying to figure out, how do I hold this thing together? How do I prevent some warlord in some corner of China from striking out on his own? How do I control the mass corruption that is a pandemic inside China? I mean, these things we don't pay any attention to them because we Americans don't think about anything seriously beyond our own borders. And it's a mistake. China is not in a position to wage war against anybody. And the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to extend Chinese economic influence, to guarantee markets and access, to trade goods. I mean, China was, at least as far as I can tell, for most of the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, always the richest country on the planet. People forget that. Say, the world is changing. Asia's in charge. Well, with the exception of the last 300 plus years, China's pretty much been the richest country in the world, which is why everybody attacked it, occupied it, tried to conquer it and use it. So we shouldn't be surprised by this. But there's an unwillingness to see something like that in anything other than a negative light in Washington. Washington wants to sort of be the colossus that bestrides the world. It's a very dumb idea. It's unnecessary.
And do you think that with, let's say, Kamala in the White House, given her sympathy for the Palestinians, things could stabilize in the Middle East?
Well, if we're going to talk about American politics, strap on your seatbelt and get ready for a very, very rough ride. If you look at the three sort of political directions right now, one is obviously the what I would call the committed left under Kamala Harris. At least she's a nominal head. Then you have Donald Trump, who is supposedly to the right, but it appears to be the prisoner of corporate interests and banking systems and financial gurus and the Israel lobby. And then you have this third candidate, Bobby Kennedy, who is really a nationalist, who is worried about the United States, who wants to focus attention on what we need to do here at home and wants to largely disengage from conflicts and crises overseas. So he's really quite willing to engage for the purpose of settling disputes and disengaging American military power. President Trump seems to want to continue to be engaged and maintain the quote-unquote empire and imperial posture. And I think Kamala Harris, she bills herself as leading, quote-unquote, the party of color. And if you look at the demographics of the American population, and you figure that about a third of people living in the country are non-Europeans now, that can only be a divisive force designed to threaten the so-called white people. And you've got to remember that her whole platform that she stands on is really built on the same sort of Antifa, Black Lives Matter mentality that discards the past as fundamentally flawed, inherently evil, because it's white and it's Western and it's European, and therefore it's bad. It's straight out of Karl Marx's manifesto. Strip everything out and start over. She wants to start from scratch and build this new world with people of color largely in charge and running the show. What a hell of a mix you've got. You've got three candidates like that. They could not all be more different, but the only one who talks substantively about solutions to the housing problems, to the financial situation, to the enormous sovereign national debt, to the endless overseas military commitments and warfare, is Bobby Kennedy. Everybody else, even though she says she's the party of color, she's not willing to get out of Ukraine. She's unwilling to do anything very differently in the Middle East, regardless of what she says, because the people around her are overwhelmingly in the Israeli camp. The same thing is true for Mr. Trump. So it's a strange thing. It's like Trump on the one side and Kamala on the other are both wings of the same uniparty. And then there's one candidate in the middle, but he is actively suppressed by the mainstream media.
Yeah, he's only
suppressed by the
airtime.
mainstream media. How can he get his message out?
Yeah,
it's very tough.
I mean, he's getting airtime from the alternative podcasts like Joe Rogan and the others, but that's not enough yet. Maybe in 4 years, but right now mainstream media, of course, are still dominating. But what's the percentage of people that could possibly or are going to vote for RFK, you think? Realistically?
I think that he could get at least 22 to 25%.
That's a lot.
Depending about what happens over the next 2 months, he could get as much as a third or more. What he needs to win is about 34%. At that point, he will have enough to pull ahead of both of the opponents, because they will be reduced to about 30% to 33%. I mean, we've been through this before. We went through similar elections. We went through this with Abraham Lincoln. He went in as a dark horse, as a sort of minority candidate, taking positions at the time that one would probably compare with Bobby Kennedy's. He was not an advocate for war at all. He was an advocate for finding a solution to preserve the Union. He decried slavery and thought that it should go away, but made it abundantly clear that his first cause was to hold the Union together. So he was by no means some sort of radical figure, but there were others at the time running against him who were. Miraculously, he was elected.
Yeah, interesting. And going back to the Middle East, just to sort of write down the solution. And the solution would, of course, be some sort of a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But doesn't Hamas hold the key by if they would release the hostages? Would that be a first step towards some kind of arrangement, treaty?
The problem right now is that a great deal of blood has been spilled. Blood in Ukraine and blood in the Middle East. The more blood that is spilled, the more difficult it becomes to reach any sort of accommodation. Right now, I see no evidence, no matter how much the Israelis may or may not like Netanyahu, that the majority of Israelis are ready to compromise on much of anything if it involves the emergence of an independent Palestinian state. At the same time, so many Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs have been killed and brutalized. There is not a great deal of willingness on the part of the Muslim Arabs for compromise. In fact, I think the elites in the region, people like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and others, are very much at risk because their populations are enraged by what has happened in Gaza, absolutely enraged. And if they are viewed as betraying Muslim Arabs, and right now there are a lot of people who see them in that light, particularly in the Saudi royal family, they won't last. Those elites will be swept away. This is, of course, General Sisi's problem. It's also King Abdullah's problem. They're seen in that light. And I think the same force is dragging Erdogan kicking and screaming out of a neutral stance into an active participation stance vis-a-vis Israel. So asking what kinds of steps can we embrace, I don't know. But the one thing that has to happen for any success to occur is for the President of the United States to restrain Israel and prevent it from invading southern Lebanon. I see that as probably the last straw. If the Israelis go into an all-out war with Hezbollah, and that's what it would be, because both sides understand it's a fight to the finish. That was made clear to me when I was last in Israel. I mean, the fight with Hezbollah is an existential battle, which is why they desperately need American military support in the air, missile support, and so forth, and whatever else we can provide. But unless he intervenes to say, that's it, you can't do this, we won't support you, then I don't see much hope for a positive outcome. Then I think it becomes a death struggle. And I'm not sure Israel will survive.
Well, let's just hope that everyone involved understands that this will be a fight to the death, and no one is going to win that. I mean, there won't be real victors after a war like that. It will be total chaos and with ramifications for everyone. So let's just hope people get their senses back and start to negotiate some sort of solution.
Arguably, that's what people thought at the beginning of the First World War. The president of France was asked in August of 1914 how long the war would last. And he said, well, I think probably until February or March. And they looked at him and said, why is that? Because that's when the money runs out. That was not an unreasonable statement for him to make. Well, what happened? Well, part of the problem was that the British Empire decided to bankrupt itself, and then we stepped in. We opened our credit markets to the British and the French. So they had endless credit, or so they thought. And eventually, when it became clear they were going to lose, and we were going to lose billions because we had invested in them, we entered the war, and the rest is history. So what you think at the beginning is not going to last long frequently turns into the death struggle. And I think it's kind of an exercise in what someone called competitive collapse. And I think the Israeli economy is already in ruins. And I don't see how Israel survives if it opens and widens the war. Even if we do come in and